a murder is just not going to say, okay, take me to jail always.
Right.
I mean, it's going to be like, okay, if you can take me, and then there it is.
Has anybody ever called you Danny?
Yeah, I was Danny until 6th grade, where I decided to switch to a more mature Dan. So my little brother, still calls me Danny, and some of his friends from back in the day still call me Danny, and I hate it. Like they've got.
I was going to say how you feel as a grown up being called Danny.
I don't feel it doesn't happen. Like even my parents know better. But my brother and like two of his friends who knew me back when, or it's just ingrained in them, so I let it go.
Big show today. This is the first Friday Deviant off script.
Yes, welcome to it.
Where you and I are going to yuck it up a little bit, have conversations, chit chat, chew the fat.
Keep going.
What other idioms are there?
Chop it up. Chinwag.
Yeah, but this is our first episode of Deviant Off Script, which will be in your feed on Fridays. It's a little bit of a laid back, more casual attitude around these parts where we're going to sit and chat with people who have some sort of law, crime, justice adjacent career occupation involvement.
Yeah, the exciting thing to me here is that, when we talk to a lot of these folks for the show that you're used to on Tuesdays, it's usually for a specific purpose. We want to talk to you about crime X, right? But we found over the years through talking to these folks before Deviant in our careers and news that these people are just fascinating in their own right. And, there's never the time, and it's never really the point, when you're telling a story about a crime or a criminal to get into their lives. But like, we always want to know more about these folks. So we thought this would be a good opportunity to do that. So yeah, that's why we created Deviant Off Script. And, I'm feeling pretty good about it. I'm feeling pretty excited about it. Especially I'm excited about our first guest.
Yeah, our first guest is a gentleman by the name of Mike Hammond, who we came to know through a number of different channels, but we joined him on his program, on his show.
Yes, and it's called Detective Stories because he is a detective, specifically a former homicide detective in the Chicago Police Department. Chicago being the greatest city on earth, which is where I happen to be coming to you.
Yeah, if you're going to be a homicide detective, I'm not sure you could find a bigger hot zone than Chicago.
That statement kind of belies my greatest city on earth statement.
Well, but it's also true.
Yeah. I mean, I guess you can be the greatest city on earth and also have a lot of homicides.
Yes, exactly. And that's obviously the case with Chicago. And Mike Hammond
that is obviously the case with Chicago.
It is. But I mean, if you're going to be a homicide detective, doing it in downtown, in the city of Chicago that's the place to be, right? If that's the job that you do. So it was really interesting to talk to him because he's kind of like a real life, Detective Munch from Law and Order or Detective Sipowicz from NYPD Blue. All those guys we see on TV. Detective Mike Hammond was kind of like a composite of those, right?
Yeah. And he's just, he's got that real down to earth thing, right? And he's also, you get that I've seen it all vibe from him, right?
Yes.
But he's still, even today, even though he has seen it all, he's still really interested in this stuff. Like you said, he has a podcast called Detective Stories, and so he's still, he's not over it, right? He's in this world. He knows how these things work, and crime and criminality and homicide investigations and mysteries, those still fascinate him.
And he is retired now. And one of the things I found interesting, and I think this is kind of the case with anybody that you talk to who does this kind of work, they don't ever retire, man. Like it just, they still have their case files in their offices at home. They still look at other they don't ever stop doing what they do. It's just kind of how they're wired.
Yeah. Once a cop, always a cop.
So with all that said, This is episode 1 of Deviant Off Script with Detective Mike Hammond, retired Chicago homicide detective. Detective Mike Hammond of the retired of the Chicago Police Department. Let's start with, how did you find your way into the law enforcement business?
Well, really, as whatever weird as it sounds, I had an English teacher when I was probably a junior in high school who gave me a book to read. That book I got behind me, Truman Capote's In Cold Blood. And
yes.
yeah, and I don't know, something in it just clicked, I don't think I could have articulated, certainly at that time, that I would have ended up where I'm at, but I something changed in me where I watched the news differently. I talked to like I wanted answers. It wasn't enough just to read about this. It was just such a terrible thing. And I'm like, there's something clicked inside of me that, and then as that progressed, I just kind of followed that. I went to college at Indiana State University and studied criminal psychology. And then by then I figured out I probably wanted to, do something in law enforcement. I had family ties to Chicago. I spent a lot of time up back and forth as a kid here. I grew up in kind of Western Indiana, but, and one of those family friends was kind of a legendary detective on the Chicago Police Department by the name of Barry Moran. And he had a side gig running security at a couple hotels down off our Michigan Avenue, which is our big, like, kind of shopping district, high-end shopping district here in Chicago. And he offered me a job when I got out of college working for him, like as a house detective in these hotels. And
which hotels?
That was at the Whitehall and Tremont Hotel on Delaware and what is that? Delaware and
it's Delaware, and that is literally 2-3 blocks away from where I live right now.
Is that right? Yeah. It's in the heart of everything, and this is like 1988. So at that time, like Rush Street was still really kind of active, and when I say active, I mean there was still a lot of. It was a tourist place, but there was still a lot of shady stuff going on there, and Barry knew every con man, every con game, every prostitute, every outfit guy, every policeman. He knew everybody. So that was it for me. You know what I mean? I knew then within a few months working with Barry, I want to be a detective on Chicago Police Department. And then it was like getting the master's course in all things criminal with him. And then it became a kind of matter of luck. I mean, they didn't give a test for a while. It was the early 90s by the time they gave a test. I took the test with Chicago Police Department, and then it took about a year or two for them to hire me. And I remember I got on the police department and did a variety of things which we can talk about. But then 5-6 years into my career, they gave the first detective's exam they'd given in like 15 years. And I studied harder for that than I did in, 4 years of college and 4 years of high school for anything. And I did well on it and made that first class in 2000.
What's on the detective's exam? Like, give us before we get to that. I'm curious about that. Before we get to that, I want to go back to your time with Barry. That's Detective Barry Moran.
Correct. Yeah.
Yeah. You said you learned everything, so you kind of went into the police department already kind of trained in police work. You said he taught you everything. Like, what were some of the biggest lessons that he taught you? What did you learn then before you even were police?
What to look for was the biggest thing, on the street. How do you know? Like, I would ask him these questions, like, how did you know that was the bad guy? How did you, and at first he'd look at me like, oh my God, kid, you got a long way to go. But then as he started, explaining things to me and the way people move and the way a guy who's looking is a predator moves, and it's kind of like a shift. It's almost like I grew up in kind of the woods, and when you're in the woods and you're looking for animals and that, you look for something that is not right angles, right? Something that's moving against the wind or whatever, little things. And that's exactly what that was for Barry, and just what he taught me. That was the biggest lesson, I think, besides how to communicate with people. He was really good at talking to people and kind of talking the talk and getting people to talk to him. And so that kind of patience in conversation, I learned a lot from him. But mostly what affected me the most when I got on the police department as a young policeman, working with other policemen on the West Side. I worked out of the 11th District at Harrison and Kedzie for most of my career, including when I first came into the academy. I work with guys who were third generation policemen and women, and I would hear often, like, how the hell does a kid from Indiana know that? How did you? Well, it's not that I'm anything special really, but again, that time with Barry it's hard to calculate the importance of that on my career,
Yeah. So you went into the police department, and as you mentioned, and before I rudely interrupted Andrew in his question, you took the detective's exam, and like Andrew asked, like, what's that like? What's on the exam?
It was a lot of, this is by recollection now, 20, 5 years later, but it was a lot of, it was a mixture of law and knowledge of the police department's general orders and like organization skills, things like you come to a crime scene and you got multiple choice A, B, C, D. What do you do first? What's the first thing you do, right? And some of those are like, you think, well, that's silly, but that's like you're going to be able to guess, right? Like render aid to the victim if necessary, right? Well, that's going to be the answer.
right.
You know what I mean? Like whatever. But so there's a lot of that, a lot of just knowing the law, knowing the general orders and what the general orders say. So it might be counterintuitive to what you might think as a policeman. This is going to be the first thing I would do at a crime scene. Well, the general order very likely says render aid to the victim,
right?
Secure the scene or whatever.
Well, so the thing that's interesting to me about like the concept of an exam for detectives, like so much of the work that you do, right, is about intuition or is about assessing a scene, and no two scenes are the same, right? So it's interesting to me, like how you quantify if someone's going to be a good detective or not, because I imagine there's a lot of qualities a detective has to have that you can't necessarily see on test results, right?
Right. Yeah, agreed. And I think that at some level it just becomes, well, you have to have some measure, right? If you're going to do it, if it's going to be like a tested position, you have to have some measure. So you have to come up with some testing, and it's always going to be, what it is. But
sure,
it used to be 20. I think they've increased it to 25%, 30% of a class that is meritorious, right?
Yeah.
And the joke is in Chicago, that's how the alderman gets his people in, right? But right. But I mean, what hopefully ends up happening with that is that people who like maybe don't test well, or have been shot in the line of duty, or done something that is really, that show people in the detective division, bosses on the police department, this person would be a really good detective, very likely, or this is something they really want to do. It gives them the opportunity to do that. It's Chicago, so how does that actually work out? Well, like anything else. But the tested end of it, I think that they do the best they can. I got to say, I don't, as far as the test, and you want to know that the law. It is important to know the law. You want to know the general orders, right? It's important to do that. And then some decision making, but that's really, really hard to quantify, right? So,
what about, you take the exam. What's kind of the path for you once you become a detective? I mean, I imagine you're not instantly thrown into kind of the homicide, right? You probably work your way around and do a couple different beats and rotations. What's kind of that path trajectory for you?
Well, at that time, the department was in this boon of hiring. And then, a few years later, like in the early 90s, the police department, I think I took the test for the police department with 35,000 people or something. Again, it had been years since the police department had given a test. Now I think they struggle to get 2,000 applicants for a test, but times have changed, but, and then, 5 years later, they give the first detective's exam. I think, again, we had, 6,000 people took that test for detective. So they're trying to backfill a lot of spots. And so actually I did go right into homicide. But I had a little bit laid the groundwork for that. I learned early on, I got to know, some detectives in Area 4, and I realized pretty early on, because I was taught this by older officers, more experienced, detectives always need help, right? They need witnesses found. They need, offenders found. They don't get credit for arrests. They get credit for closing cases. So, I got a bunch of murder arrests as a patrol officer simply because I had this relationship with the detectives, and they would tell me, if you can find this guy, I'm looking to question him about this murder. So we go looking for the guy, find him, and then, take him upstairs. A couple of days later, they call and say, hey, could you do an arrest report? We got this guy charged with a murder. I didn't know anything about the case, but I helped him out. So the point is that it's kind of the work I always wanted to do. And so I just learned how to communicate with the detectives and kind of learn what they did, and learn little things like, stopping when it stopped people on the street, just to remember who they were, who I stopped with, who, and kind of get that information. So when I made detective, they pulled me in a group of, maybe 15 of us of that class into homicide right away. And at that time, you had homicide was still with robbery, sex offenses, and like aggravated batteries.
Kind of like a major crimes unit.
Major crimes, right.
Yeah.
And so initially they've separated robbery out now, but I was also working robberies. But just to be clear on that, I wasn't assigned a murder on my own probably for 6 or 7 months. I was writing with older detectives, and the detective division was much older at that point. We go to roll call, and we'd have 15 people on homicide roll call, and 6, 7 of them had 20 or 30 years in the detective division. And those days are gone too, but by the time I had 5 years as a detective, I had quite a bit of seniority. By the time I had 10 years, I was probably one of the more senior homicide detectives because of that big overturn of people with a lot of time on the job.
What was your first scene, your first homicide scene? Do you remember it well?
Yeah, I do. It was a 6-year-old boy who was killed by his foster mother. It was pretty ugly. And she actually held him in a tub of cold water until he went hypothermic, and she left him there and he died.
That was your first one?
First one, yeah.
That's
pretty intense for a first one.
Yeah, it was harsh, I think that I was so intent on doing the right thing, and she was in custody, so it wasn't like a big whodunit, and that's probably why they gave it to us, but those cases are tough to prosecute. So my partner and I just really we were taking the temperature of the water and crazy stuff like that, which was fine, but it's just like, we really overdid it. And she got convicted. She did short time, unfortunately, but that's kind of the way those domestic murders sometimes work out. But it was an intense one. But my point to that was, I think I was so fixated on making sure I didn't screw anything up.
Getting it right.
Everything that I didn't. It like a lot of things in that job, the trauma or stress of that was a 6-year-old boy that his life was just a horror movie, didn't occur to me until much later.
Sure. I can't imagine, obviously this wasn't a whodunit that she was in custody, you said, but how do you, I don't know if you had to talk to her or anything like that, but how do how do you keep it together knowing that she did that to it? Like, I know crimes against children are probably the most difficult. Well, I would assume probably the most difficult, to encounter. How do you remain civil and professional with that kind of a perp?
Well, at that time, as inexperienced as I was, I leaned heavily on the detectives that had a lot more experience and supervisors I was working for. My partner and I. My partner was new too. We did have some older guys advising us, of course, and the supervisors keeping a close eye. But so I leaned heavily on them and just kind of did what they told me. Those type of cases generally aren't difficult to get statements on. But you do have to be patient. You do have to go kind of down an ugly road where you're seeming empathetic and that, it's tough to do a lot of times. What was much tougher years later when we started, it was mandated by law that we record all these interviews, videotape all these interviews with homicide suspects. We didn't mind, contrary, I think, to what a lot of people thought at the time. We didn't mind that. I mean, it was good for us, and it turned out to be very good. But it was very stark and not fun the first time that I published one of those videos in front of a jury. Publishing meaning letting the judge and jury, the prosecutor basically brings it out, shows the judge and jury, and I walk through and hearing myself. And that first one was a child murder too. And hearing myself try and be empathetic with someone who's done something like that on video was pretty harsh. I thought. Sideways at the jury, like, boy, I hope they understand why I'm going down this road.
That's technique. That's interrogation technique, right? Like, you don't feel empathetic, but you have to appear empathetic.
Correct. Yeah.
Obviously, so much of the work you did was, investigations, obviously. But the work you did was incredibly dangerous too. Did you have? I mean, you got up every day and put your badge on and walked out the door, and it could have been the last day. I mean, did you have some close calls and some tough situations that you found yourself in, out on the street?
Yeah, of course. I mean, I think that my mother has passed, and so has my grandmother. So I'm comfortable saying it. I mean, I think that there is this thought process that a little bit out there that's a little less dangerous when you're a detective because you're not actively, involved. That's actually not true. It is always less dangerous than being a patrolman is the most dangerous job a policeman does, I think, because of the obvious stuff, right? Whether you're a county sheriff out in the hills, or a state trooper way out in the middle of nowhere, or a patrolman on the west or south side of Chicago, because you never know what you're getting into. You don't know what this call is. If it's domestic, you can kind of get wrapped around it. Domestics can be ugly. You just don't know, and you go to hundreds of them, right? And nothing happens. You stop a car, you don't know what's in the car, right? Mostly. And so that's what's really dangerous. But as detectives, especially I think in Chicago, and I'm guessing this is true in most places, we wanted to do the work ourselves. And certainly when it came to at-risk things, you don't want to put somebody at risk to do your job. It's not to say that if a situation is going to be bad, you don't call the SWAT team or whatever. But I mean, we were looking for our own killers. We were looking for our own witnesses all the time. And so, in that, there were lots of fights, lots of, the gun battles were not as common probably as when I was in like the citywide units and the gang units where you're actively in these areas that are hot. But it happens. I mean, I didn't get in any shootings as a detective, thankfully, but I had partners or friends that I worked with that did. Got shot at a couple of times. I mean, got many times. A murder is just not going to say, okay, take me to jail always.
Right.
I mean, it's going to be like, okay, if you can take me, and then there it is. So Yeah.
Especially, I'm guessing, especially at that time in Chicago. Well, I mean, not that much has changed in this respect, but you're probably dealing with a lot of gang violence as well, a lot of gang type murders, and I'm sure those are especially hairy to get into the middle of when you start asking questions and looking for people.
Yeah, I mean that's the majority of the cases here in Chicago are gang drug related, competition for narcotic sales and that. And those cases are tough to solve. They're not necessarily tough to like identify the killers, but they are tough to get prosecuted, right? Because it's hard to get people to cooperate. And I don't blame them a lot of times, but so yeah, that was always the rub. Like you're always going out and talking to people that are not going to talk to you or not going to want to see you there, and you could. I'm sure it's true, but back then, if you got a tie on, you're driving around in an unmarked, bubble Chevy, we called it. Everybody knew you, even if you were a burglary detective, there's homicides out.
I imagine, when you tell people or when people learn who you are and that you are a retired Chicago detective, the first thing they say is, "Oh man, I bet you have some stories." So I'm going to basically clear the deck here and ask you, can you tell us some stories?
Yeah. I mean, I got a lot of stories. Or, the other thing that people say, it's either that or, boy, I bet you've seen a lot of stuff. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I don't know how to even quantify it really. Just hundreds and hundreds of murders and thousands of dead bodies. I mean, I think that, and I will tell you, even though it was my dream job, and I feel so lucky to have been able to do it. It was a lot of stress and all that, and I was so excited to make detective. But about 6 months into it, I hit a wall where I just was like, this is what it's going to be every day for the rest of my life. I mean, because every day on the west side of Chicago, somebody gets killed or shot or dies, and you're out to determine whether it's a murder or not, whether it's an accidental death, an overdose, medical death, suicide, all of those things. And especially as a new detective, they want you to see it, get the experience, right? So we're out
right
every day. Literally, I'm going out on some dead body, and I was just like, I don't know how I sustained this for a lifetime, So I went through a period where I had to figure that out, and I did eventually. But yeah, I mean, you name it. When it comes to murders, I don't think there's, ironically enough, except for serial killers. I never really worked on these serial killer cases.
That's the one that didn't happen, right? Yeah.
No, it's not something we really see. It does happen here. I mean, there are. I know detectives. I work peripherally, helping on a couple of things, but mostly it's just every other type of thing that you can imagine. And the case that I'm probably best known for on the police department was this murder of this young 21-year-old woman. 2 days after Thanksgiving 2001, she was found shot to death in the back of her car in the 1300 block of West Carroll, which is, if you're not familiar with the city, it's the near west side. It's only about 2 miles kind of northwest a little bit, which isn't very far in the city from the Sears Tower or Willis Tower or whatever.
It's Sears. We still call it Sears Tower. It'll always be Sears Tower.
Yeah, right.
Sorry, Willis Corporation.
Reference point, right? So, and that was a real whodunit that took us 4 years to identify the killer, 6 years to get him charged, and 9 and then 15 years for it finally to be adjudicated. 9 years he got convicted the first time. Appellate court overturned it, sent it back for something they claimed his attorney should have done and didn't do. We retried it, and he was convicted again 15 years after the murder, and he died in prison about a year ago. But yeah, that case was just a grinding, like phone records back before it was all computerized, and DNA tracking. There was DNA on the scene that was critical, and we had to identify it was the killer's DNA. It was a sperm that was inside of her, and we had to identify. So we had to talk to everybody she ever had any contact with. She wasn't a promiscuous girl or anything, but any guy that she ever had any contact with in her life, we had to track him down and ask him consent to a buccal swab, which is DNA standard. And
right.
After a while of doing that, we kind of got to the point where we were like, if we walked up and somebody consented right away, we're like, yeah, not the killer, right? I mean,
yeah.
But you got to go through it, and you got to go through it, right? And the killer ended up actually being an 18-year informant for a commander in the police department, which was a weird kind of twist. But the commander was great. He didn't try and run interference for the guy at all. He was very helpful. But so that case was it took up most of my career, really, start to finish.
That's the one that was with you, always with you.
Yeah, that was the one, really, and that's a kind of in a kind of a micro. That's how it's difficult in Chicago, because I really the reason that case probably gets solved is because I got assigned to the cold case homicide unit in 2005, I think, and that was funded by federal grants. And when I went there just to kind of try something new, and I always liked looking at the older cases and the old outfit cases and that, but that gave me the time where I wasn't being assigned new cases on a regular basis. It gave me the time just to focus on that, because there was a laundry list of things that just had to get done, those phone records and that stuff. And that's what I did. And that's what enabled us really to solve it, was having that time to do it, because without that, it's, 5 steps forward, 3 steps back all the time, because you get, okay, we're getting headway. We got somewhere to go, like on these phone records, tracking this person down. And then, okay, hey, Hammond, you're up. I got a guy shot at, whatever, Costner and Madison's yours. Okay. So now we're back a month again, or 3 weeks,
Yeah.
So that was the gig.
So, yeah, I mean, this thing's always on your mind for years. And like, I guess you could only really work on it at a certain point unless you're catching again, right? And that in the TVs and in TV and movie, you have the trope of like, the detective who just can't get this case out of their head, and they wake up, it's sweating in the middle of the night, and they write some thought down, like, is that how it works? Is that when something stays with you like that, is that the experience?
Yeah, to a degree it is. It was hard not to be thinking about it all the time. Like, what am I missing here? Like, I stared at those crime scene photos, which were pretty ugly, for I just don't know how many hours, just thinking, what am I missing here? What are we missing here? And I talked to other detectives about it ad nauseum, just like, what am I missing here? What am I looking at, here? And yes, I mean, I wouldn't say that I was waking up in the middle of the night, except, her mother would call me sometimes in the middle of the night, just and grieve, which was okay, but yeah, I mean, I think it's that way. I just talked to a friend of mine and interviewed for my show a guy that I worked with for years, who's one of the best homicide detectives I think that probably exists in this country, and he has a case that a girl that went missing in 1992 body's never been found. And, he's still on that, and he's retired. And, so we did a show about it, my podcast, and he wants to find out, the family wants to find out what happened to her. I feel that, it's hard. That part of it just doesn't go away.
Have you had that experience? Is there one that you haven't solved that just stays with you?
Yeah, a girl, it actually wasn't my case. It was one of those old ones, but a girl named Becky Breedlove, who was killed 50 years ago, 1974, when I was 9 years old. But that was a kind of a pet case that was passed on in Area 4, and I was like the last guy to get it from these 2 detectives.
Interesting. So cases are passed down?
Yeah, especially before there was like cold case, that in the areas there would be kind of cases that stuck with detectives, and like after a while you're like, I just want you to know about this, so somebody's going on with it, and it's much harder to do. It became much harder to do when the manpower dropped and everybody's scrambling to cover the new cases. But yeah, Becky Breedlove was stabbed to death in her apartment in 1974, and I picked that up in the early 2000s. And there's evidence, unfortunately, that we can't find in our evidence section that may be gone forever. Who knows? But just a girl that was stabbed to death in her apartment, and even though I didn't have that scene, I picked it up years later. I could you feel that, hunger emanating off your friends, your coworkers. You're like, I want this done.
We want to get this one.
Yeah. And so I'm kind of lucky in that regard, in that the cases that I worked on myself, there's not a lot of them that we didn't get solved. There are a few, and they're going to be tough. I mean, because it's those things where you kind of know who the killer is, but it's very difficult cases to put together. There's this young guy that joined a biker gang club and was killed at a party, and his mother was from like Oregon or something, was calling every day, and I felt for her. And I had a couple of people who were in federal custody who told me what happened with that murder, but if his own guys are not going to stand up and solve that, it's never going to get solved. That's just the way it works, unfortunately.
Let me ask you this. Dan and I are huge fans of police shows and
good police shows.
Good police, namely NYPD Blue, which is the GOAT in terms of cop shows.
Homicide, Life on the Streets. So
my question, and a lot of times you see in these shows, right? There's a lot of pressure. There's a lot of pressure on detectives to clear cases because of political pressure, organizational pressure. Is that a real thing when you're kind of in the weeds and in the real world? Do you have pressure that's put on you from, your lieutenant or, the mayor's office is running for re-election? Like, we got to clear these cases. Talk to me a little bit about that and kind of the pressure that you may have felt to get these things solved.
Yeah. I get that question often, actually. And I got to be honest, I never really felt that. I mean, I think we put much more pressure on ourselves than anybody did from above us, but I worked for really good bosses, my sergeants, my lieutenants, and in doing that, they held us accountable, like, what's going on with this case? What's going on with this? Where are you at with this? Well, you told me you were looking for that guy a month ago. You still haven't found him, or, whatever. You still haven't talked to him. I mean, accountability was always there, but it was not ever, there were times I would say, this is another, whatever, I'm being a little bit silly with this, but it's true. I mean, sometimes you would get, the mayor wants to know what's going on with this. And that lasted about a week until the next crisis came up. And then you just ride that out. Like, okay, we're on it. You know what I mean? Like, especially to the point where, you just want somebody locked up. I never felt that. Never felt that. It was always, make sure you have it right. And when I say we held ourselves accountable, you were accountable to ourselves and to each other, but also to the victims' families, and so that was more pressure really than I ever got politically. And I'm not going to sit here and tell you it doesn't exist. I know that there's always, especially when, it's a heater, right? A child is killed or whatever, somebody God forbid somebody gets, killed in the tourist area or whatever,
right.
You know what I mean? Like,
Did you guys have to again, sorry, this is just kind of interesting to me. Like, did you guys have to maintain a clearance rate of a certain number? Like, was that something that you guys had to do in the homicide department division?
No, I think that might've been a thing, maybe prior to the 80s. I don't know, because it always seemed like when they talk about the 50s, 60s, 70s, the clearance rates were always nearly 100%, right? It was really, really unusual. It was more the kind of the anomaly than the norm to not solve murders. But with the probably late 70s, early 80s, certainly by the 90s, with the advent of open air drug markets and all this competition for, narcotics money, and that clearance rate changed where it'd be, 40%, 30%. We never even talked about it really. I mean, other than to say, like tease each other,
Right.
Come on, man, solve some murders, whatever, you're 40%. But the issue is, again, you're talking about mostly of those cases are not whodunits or
Right.
like big mysteries. It's like you got a pretty good idea. It's just whether you can get them prosecuted or not is the case. And I'm not. That sounds like a excuse, or I'm like being glib about it. I don't mean to, but that's just the reality of the way it was. I mean, back in the day, it was your murders were domestic murders and bar fights, robberies going wrong. I mean, things that were
pretty
ones,
easy.
Yeah, the ones that were, you look at those cold case files. I looked at cases going back into the 50s, and Judith Mae Anderson was killed in 1957, and we got assigned. This is the way things do work in Chicago. Sometimes assigned a cold case, and it was coming up on the 50th anniversary of her murder, and the Chicago Tribune newspaper called and asked for the police department for a statement. Are you guys doing? We're going to do an article about the 50th anniversary of this murder. What do you guys have going on it, right? And then we get the call in cold case. Hey, you guys pick that case up, do something with it. The Tribune's going to do it. Okay, we did a lot of work on that murder too, but 50 years later, boy, it's tough to find anybody that's still even alive.
That kind of gets me thinking. Like, we hear there are a lot of cases in the news today. I think right now the most prominent being, the Richard Allen case in Delphi. Like, did they get the right guy? And, as a homicide detective, your experience, like, how easy is it to get the wrong guy? Like, how often does it happen?
Well, I'll tell you, my experience is it's so hard for me to grasp that it happens at all. And I'm not denying that it does. It's just that, I mean, we have to jump through so many hoops to get somebody charged with a murder. And there's always somebody backfilling with questions and information. Whether it's the state's attorney's office or our bosses or whatever. It was never kind of like, nobody just going to take my word that this guy killed this person, right? Or that I found this witness that says this person killed this person. And so how does it happen? I think that there are reasons that it can happen, but it's not easy. I mean, I think that you just have to be careful, I think, all the time that you are asking yourself the questions that a defense attorney is going to ask or question, and kind of be your own devil's advocate and say, all right, well, this looks great. What's the problem with this theory, right? And so, I don't think it's difficult. So in that Judith Mae Anderson case, there's a guy in Texas who we went and interviewed who was a strong suspect in that case. And man, they went to unbelievable lengths to try and get him charged with Judith Mae's murder. He was convicted of 6 rapes up in Rogers Park on our north side of Chicago. And Judith Mae Anderson lived on the west side, but basically in a nutshell, she was at a friend's house. She called her home to ask to stay a little while longer to watch a film. And her mother said, no, you got to come home. It's like 11 o'clock on a Friday night. She starts walking home, never makes it. By the next day, they're out looking for her. There was more than 1,000 policemen assigned at one time or another to look for her. She's found, unfortunately, dismembered, floating in 2 barrels a week later, I think, in Montrose Harbor, which, if you're not familiar with Chicago, is along our lakefront north, kind of north side of the city. So this particular offender that they suspected may have done that murder, he got convicted of 6 sexual assaults. He was charged with another murder that he got found not guilty of. But to tell you the lengths they went to, they put an undercover detective, who's a Japanese-American detective, in the Cook County jail with him as a cellmate for 6 weeks. Like, I can't imagine. We wouldn't do that for a day now. There's no
I thought
way.
that stuff only happened on TV. Wow. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, there's no way you can ensure anybody's safety. The sheriff would never, ever agree to it.
Yeah.
But this is 1957, 58, whatever. And this very intrepid detective did this. And the guy never really clearly said that he killed her. And they never charged him with that murder. So we went, he's still alive. He was, as far as I know. We went down and interviewed him, see if we get a DNA sample from him, even though there was no evidence really. The only thing we have was the barrels. But he did eventually consent. And I'll tell you, my partner and I, was senior guy to me in cold case. He just flatly thought the guy didn't do it. And I was really difficult. I can't say for sure he didn't. All I could tell you is every part of my instinct told me this guy's got a lifetime of bad shit behind him. He is a bad human being. We had a Texas Ranger with us, and I mean, that guy was like a real, like, what's his name? Chuck Norris, Texas Ranger guy.
Yeah. Walker, Texas Ranger.
Yeah. He looks like Will Smith, and he's just big, intense guy, great guy. We're friends to this day. But even he was like coming out of that interview with that guy's like, oh man, that guy sent chills up my spine, man. But did he kill Julie Mae Anderson? No evidence to say that enough that we could charge him. I don't know to this day. I really don't, So it's tough. You're a Delphi guy. I don't know a lot about that case. I've heard more as the trial started. I think everybody has. You guys know a lot more about it than I have. I wouldn't even hazard a guess. I mean, you guys are more, informed on that than me. I guess we'll see, but
Well, yeah, I mean, don't want to make this into a Delphi podcast, even though a lot of people would like that, but but I think, and I guess, I bring up that case because there is very clear evidence that, is that the investigation in that particular case, there were, botches happened, chain of evidence, mistakes happened, shortcuts were taken, leaps were made that maybe should not have been made. So, in the wrong people being arrested, and I'm not saying Richard Allen is guilty or not guilty, we'll let the justice system take its course there. But, you hear people going free because of the Innocence Project or they were wrongfully convicted, which means that they were arrested. The investigation, something went wrong and the wrong guy was arrested and charged, right? So clearly it happens. And, just my guess is maybe it happens in, Chicago's a very professional police department, right? There is a very, it's been around, it's a big city. You guys know how to solve murders, right? It seems that these people who are wrongfully arrested, it seems to happen more in, rural areas where maybe there is less evidence of experience in solving homicides. I don't know. I'm just rambling here. I know a little bit, I do.
I get what you're saying. I don't know. I mean, when I was in cold case, because it was, funded by federal grants, we had the money to travel, and a lot of these cases would take us all over. And when we talked previously, and you were talking about the guy up in Alaska, you guys saw how
Israel Keys,
Israel Keys, how critical that is, right? Because over time, I mean, that guy was a very transient guy, so that's a little different. But over the course of time, people spread out, right?
Mm-hmm.
Witnesses, whatever. And so that ability to travel was super helpful and helps all these murders. But I saw a lot of professional behavior, professional work all over the country. I think that it is helpful to have the experience, no doubt about it. The thing I'll say, well, first of all, I don't want to let this go because I just have to say it because it's, it's from my side. I have very strong opinions I won't bore you with about the Innocence Project and all that. I'll just say that.
I was going to ask you about that, but I'm glad you talked about it.
Here's what muddies all those waters, right? There are not tens, but hundreds of millions of dollars at stake in all of that. I mean, since 2012, I think the city of Chicago has paid out more than $1 billion in lawsuits. Every year, the city pays out something like $40 million hiring private attorney law firms to represent the police department in lawsuits, right? Now, is that
police aren't allowed to chase anybody anymore in Chicago?
Right. And it's dictated a lot of what the police department does now, for better or worse. But I mean, I'll just leave it at this, because I don't want to turn your podcast into a political discussion. When you have that much money at stake, things are always going to be squirrely, man. And so you can never take things on their face. You just can't. It is very, very difficult to retry a case of a guy that's been in prison for 30 years. There are cases there are difficult cases to prove the first time you go through, and it's all fresh and the witnesses are cooperative. But 30 years later, so if I was a guy that wanted to make a bunch of money and I didn't have a lot of ethics, I think, trolling the prisons for people that have been 30, 40 years is pretty low-hanging fruit, and getting a judge to send it back knowing that, it's going to be nearly impossible to prosecute. All of that would be fair game to me. It's fine. Guy's been in 30 years. He's been in. You could argue that justice has been done anyway. But then when the first thing they do is come out and hold a press conference and say he was innocent all along, and we're suing the city, I think people should always look at that with a skeptical eye, So
I promise I was going to ask you this before we started talking about this part of the conversation. But after 30 years in homicide and as a detective, how do you feel about defense attorneys?
Good ones I have a really a lot of respect for, because look, a good defense, everybody has the right to counsel. I mean, and look, I like the judges that you always like a friendly judge, whatever you call that. But the truth of the matter is the judges that I appreciated most were the judges. And I find this is true with a lot of former prosecutors who are judges. Not all, but it's common, I think, more common. And also probably public defenders and defense attorneys who become judges, but they're harder on the prosecution and us as detectives than anything, right? Than the defense or whatever. They want us to prove the case. But if we prove the case, then they're more apt to launch the person off, for life or whatever, or long sentences. That kind of judge I always appreciated, because I want to be confident in myself. I'm not perfect. And you try and put everything together. You're not there at the scene. You're trying to put the case together, and you believe with confidence that you have the right person, that you're convincing the jury this is the right person. But it's nice to have that check and balance of a judge who's going to, enforce that out, and a good defense attorney who's going to ask questions and say, hey, look, and it's how do you tell? Well, if a guy comes out screaming at me, or attorney comes out screaming and says, isn't it true? That's the best, isn't it true? Isn't it true? Yeah, no, I don't think I'm really, no, I didn't beat anybody. Yeah. You know what I mean? Like, no, right. No. Then, like, okay, well, you don't really have anything. You know what I mean? Like, good attorneys, really good ones, they know, like, these cases are difficult to put together, right? And especially it always takes 3 or 4 years, even if you have the offender in custody on the scene. In Cook County, USA, those cases don't get adjudicated for 3, 4, 5 years, right? So that's
here in Cook County, you hear about prosecutors declining to prosecute all the time on seemingly solid cases too. Yeah.
So
why is that?
I'll let you take that one, Mike.
Well, I think that we've gone down a road of having some prosecutors, especially we have one here, that decide that they're going to try and kind of change the judicial system on their own. And we with, I think, good intention, we passed this no cash bail law in this state a year or so ago. And the intent, I hope, of that was so that people who are arrested for menial crimes, for, narcotics crimes that really need addiction help and not incarceration, so they're not sitting in the county jail for years on end, not getting help they need, take, taxpayer money, all that stuff. But what it's turned out to be is that, we're finding that there's somebody on one of the social media platforms that's keeping track, and there's been 80 some people since that was enacted that were charged with violent gun crimes, who were released without bonds, who have committed without bond, and who have committed murders since they were released.
Plenty.
And so I'm not sure that exact number. Don't quote me on, but it's a big number.
It's a high number. I don't know what it is either, but
and it's like, that's not. Was that anybody's intent, really? You know what I mean?
No, I mean, the way the law is written and the way the law is interpreted is, it's almost like, they're trying to solve they're trying to split what's the metaphor? They're trying to cut a piece of, this isn't the metaphor, but I'll give this one anyway. They're trying to cut a piece of celery with an axe instead of a scalpel, right?
Yeah. Right. That's good.
Sure.
Again, we could draw this out all day, but I mean, I think I am not like, and I'm not, don't mean this to bang on the IDOC people or the wardens of these prisons, but our prison system is a failed entity in this country. It needs revamping, and there's nobody that's more a proponent than that than me. We can't continue to have these gladiator academies where we send these people to prison and they have no hope of ever kind of recovering with, except for that, whatever that 10% is, are able to survive it. But it shouldn't be that way. It can't be that way. It's not sustainable. And we just keep trudging along with it. Do we need reforms? Absolutely. But as you said, Dan, we're going about it in such a messed up way that it's killing people. It literally is. And shouldn't be that.
Yeah. We're providing broad solutions to narrow problems and vice versa too, like at least here in Illinois, is the way it seems. Not to get us.
To circle back to our original point. I mean, one of the things you have to do as a detective, I think, is mistakes get made. They do. I've made them. You know what I mean? But you don't want to double down on a mistake by making it into a bigger problem, right?
Sure.
So just the toughest thing for a defense attorney, a good defense attorney, is when you take the stand and just say, yep, I messed that up. That's my mistake, right? Yeah. Instead of trying, because that's not what they want you to do. They want you to double down and make excuses or say, that was somebody else or pass the buck or whatever. You don't want to, they're going to happen. We're human beings. They're going to be evidence that you mean to inventory that you find in a file months later. And so you just have to say, inventory it then. Don't double down on it. Don't wait till trial and inventory it, or bring it to the state's attorney and say, hey, don't do that. Inventory it, do it, and just put it in a report. This is on me, whatever.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting you say that because, just to circle back to the Delphi case, like there's instances where it's, perhaps an error is made and an attempt to keep that error under wraps winds up being the worse than actually just acknowledging the error, right?
Yeah. Or you're compounding the error by committing other errors, right?
Right. It's like, it's not the thing, it's the way you react to the thing. It almost
self-perpetuates in the case of
Delphi. Yeah.
And to a degree, I have to say, I think there is an experience thing that does go into that. Like, okay, look, this is not the end of the world, right? I've seen this 100 times before. We can, the worst thing you can do is try and make it something else. Then you got a problem, right? So that is an experience thing, and doing it enough, you get. But I think also there's a human nature thing there too. That human nature is kind of like, got to make an excuse for this because everybody does, right? It's really hard to do
especially with that is such a high profile crime. So many people are watching every single move that happens, and part of the reason that investigators got dinged on that until the arrest was that they were so non-communicative. There were very few updates, and how humans work. We don't like voids; we fill it with our own information, and so it's. It's just such an odd case, and I imagine the pressure to solve it, the pressure to close it in any major high-profile case, be it Delphi, be it any other major national media story that's a murder. It's got to be, I'm guessing the pressure just has to be that much extra than your typical homicide where the glare of the media isn't there.
Yeah, it is. I mean, the thing, murders in general, the stakes are high, right? Mm-hmm. When you're investigating a murder, the stakes are just high, no matter how much press coverage it's got, because it is basically the worst crime. There I guess there are levels of that, but the worst crime a human can make, and certainly the stakes of that. You're talking about somebody's dead, and somebody's freedom is likely going to go away because of it, right? So the stakes are always high, and you have to treat it as such. With that, then it becomes that internal pressure, external pressure to, oh man, I screwed this up. Now what? Well, yeah, I mean, I think there is some experience that goes into that, talking to experienced people, but yeah, and again, I don't know anything about the Delphi case, but I think that, and the communication end, that's another slippery slope that's come up when I've talked to people before. Why don't talk more? Why don't the police communicate more? As a detective, I think ideally you don't ever talk about the case, because you'd like to have the information be very tight, so that if you hear a piece of information, ideally it comes from, and this is just a saying, I don't mean to be inappropriate here, but it comes from the man, right? Not from the man who heard it from the man, or the man that heard it from the man who talked to the man, but from the man, person one. And the more the information gets out there, the more difficult that is to control.
Yeah, but in the direct knowledge of what you're looking for, right. Yeah.
The real world, it just doesn't work that way. You have to communicate with people. People are afraid. People are scared. They're angry. So you have to communicate with people. But that's should always be, in my mind, that is the job of administrators and communicators. It's not the job of the detective to do that, because you have to be focused on what you're doing and that control of information, right? I know you guys come from the media side, and I would never ever talk to the media when I was working. Never. I got ordered to a couple times, and even that came back and bit me a little bit, because I did an interview. I was told to do an interview with a reporter once. The guy didn't do anything wrong. He's a pretty decent guy, it seemed like, but the family was very upset with me because there was information that came out in that article that I hadn't discussed with him. I hadn't discussed it with him because there was avenues that he went down in his article were fair that I had already shut down. Like, I know this can't be true because of this, and that, or that person was in custody at this time, or whatever it was, I don't recall. So I'm not going to go to the family with every little thing and say, yeah, this was a possibility, but I know it's not a possibility. Why do that? You know what I mean? So this article comes out, and they were just really, well, you didn't tell us any of that, and I'm like, yeah, well, okay, here's why I didn't tell you that, now it's not that reporter's fault. He's doing his job, but that I'm just illustrating my experience with that. It's like, there's no upside to it for me, but I do understand. That's why in a city our size, we have a whole news relations unit. You know what I mean? That's their job, not mine.
Yeah. So like, just thinking about and being mindful of the time, and you've been so generous with yours, like just thinking about all these high profile cases and thinking about those, like, now that you're doing what we're doing, now that you're in the true crime space, and you have your own show, in your, I'm sure your antenna are up about, all the big true crime cases out there. And I'm sure you knew about this while you were a detective too, but if someone came to you and said, Mike Hammond, retired detective, Chicago Police, you get to choose one crime out there, anywhere, that we'll open the books for you, see what you can do. What's that one crime that you would choose?
Probably, I mean, right off the top of my head, I could probably come up with a bunch, but right off the top of my head, I'd like to know what's happened with, I'd like to know what's happened with all the Native American girls out on these reservations. I'd like to know if there's actually somebody out there that has killed a bunch of them, or if there are a bunch of murders, or if they're simply, we've created such a ugly environment for them to live in, that they just escape it and go on and don't.
That is a fascinating case that I don't think a lot of people know about.
Yeah, well, and the thing is too,
Cases, yeah.
Cases, right? Many. And the thing that is fascinating me about it too is like it's not like we don't have multitudes of young poor women in this city who go missing or end up dead or whatever. It's not like we don't have that, and I couldn't focus on that too. The thing about the Native American girls out there, it falls into this weird space where the FBI has a very they have jurisdiction if it's a murder, right?
Yeah.
If it's not a murder, it falls to the tribal police or local police, and local police have very limited jurisdiction there. And so that's a big chasm, because if it's ruled like an accidental death or a missing person or unknown, it's not a murder. So the FBI is not looking at it. The tribal police may have some good people, but they don't have the resources to look at them. It was pretty well articulated in that Taylor Sheridan film,
Wind River.
Wind River, correct.
It's one of my favorite films.
That's a dramatic piece, but I mean, it lays out these things. It's true.
Absolutely.
So that just, I don't know why, it fascinates me, and I think that you could get answers if you could spend the time and work on it. But so that's
it's also so disproportionate too.
It does seem like that, yeah. But I often, even inside of that, I wonder if it is actually disproportionate to the number of young Black and brown women from poor communities here that are killed or go missing or die. I don't know if it actually is disproportionate or not, but it does seem that way. I agree. And they got nobody really looking at it, I think, is what really troubles me. You know what I mean? I think that that's why it sticks with me, because all these other cases, there are cases that fascinate me all the time, and I hear and I think, oh, that would be really interesting to look at that, or I hear about cases, and I have to be careful. Like, my daughter asked me to watch the show Blackbird, which is about this guy who killed a bunch of women there in Indiana and in Illinois. And I go down that road, boy, it's, my mind really can go down that road of like, oh, I think that you could get something done with that case, like,
right.
All right. Reel that back in. Like,
before you know it, she comes downstairs and you've like got a file folder of papers and you're looking through it. And it's like,
taking notes. Right.
So again, and this is kind of the last thing I'll ask you is the work that you did is of great interest to so many people. If it wasn't, there wouldn't be, a laundry list of police procedurals of, Homicide, NYPD Blue, The Wire, all those. But with all of that, interest in the work that you did, what's the biggest misconception, or what's the biggest thing that the general public has wrong about homicide detectives?
I think the misconception that I would like to cull the most is that we don't really care who gets charged as long as we solve the case. You know what I mean? I think that that is a misconception that is wholly false. In my experience, you know what I mean? I never met a detective that didn't care about who went to prison as long as somebody went to prison. I mean, I think when you get involved with victims' families and that you feel responsible to them, you don't ever want that to happen for two reasons. One, you don't want to be lying or misrepresenting what you're doing to the families. And two, if you do that, then the real killer's still out there. And then what good have you done, So that's probably the biggest thing that I would like to change in people's thought process. Whoever does think that, I don't know how common it is, but the other thing too is, it's not nearly as sexy as they play on TV. You know what I mean? There's a lot more paperwork and a lot more grind to it, and there's a lot more bad food involved than there is drinking with pretty girls at nightclubs after.
Well, that's perfect setup for my real last question. What is your favorite police procedural television show? Or what's the one that you think is the most accurate?
Well, the first season of The Wire was painfully accurate. Like, wow.
Music to our ears.
Yeah, man.
I think that first season of True Detective in those two characters that was so brilliantly written that, again, you kind of lose me when you go down the serial killer road, but I understand that makes for great television and things. It's just that it's not as common when you talk about the total amount of murders, but whatever, makes for good stuff. But in those two characters, and Woody Harrelson and Matthew McConaughey did such a great job. They had good advisors on that, I'm guessing. It was well written. But in those two guys, I saw a kind of conglomeration of myself and a lot of people I worked with over the years. The intensity, the mistakes, the humanity of it. Like, I'm not saying that any one of us were either one of those people, but as a whole, you could see a lot of behaviors like
a composite.
Yeah, right. And the communication between them in the car, I love that, because that's what it's really like. You're driving around with the same person all the time, and mainly you kill the time by giving each other a hard time and teasing each other.
Or Russ, shut the fuck up.
Right.
We love True Detective season 1.
5 minutes, right? Yeah, that's
my last question is the same question we always end our interviews on. What did we not ask you? If you were us interviewing you, what should we have asked you that we didn't?
No, you guys are pretty thorough. I mean, I think
we'd love to hear that too.
Yeah, it's. I mean, this is our actually second time having these conversations, right? So this is, I guess the one question maybe that for another time that maybe you can ask other detectives, what would you do to help to bolster homicide, solving homicides and getting killers convicted and getting justice for families? What would be some of the things that if you were in charge of, if they made you czar tomorrow, what would you do to make things better? You know what I mean? That's the only thing. But
what's your answer to that?
More detectives would be the start. It's a short answer in a short period, but I think,
head count.
Yeah. Resources. But I mean, I think that it's so multifaceted. That's a whole nother conversation probably, but I think getting the victims, and that's the whole thing I'm doing with I'm trying to sell a podcast or anything, but the reason I started to do this podcast on my own and get involved with the one I'm doing is to kind of give the victims' families and the voice and kind of shine a light on some of these victims and cases that are already solved, because I just, from my perspective, and I think our perspectives, and probably you guys too, the work you do, I mean, I just don't think the victims, get enough light shined on them. It becomes about the killers, you know what I mean? Because it needs to, and it should, but it becomes about them, whether they did it or didn't do it, whether they're in prison or should be in prison or not, whether, and even the case where they're really horrible people. Israel Key's a good example. He becomes the focus of it, right? Because it's hard not to. It's like, what do you do with a guy like that? And
right.
But
he's so outside of other people. It's so outside our frame of reference that it's tough not to just draw your attention there.
Yeah, right. And also, I mean, what makes that tough too is that the victims' families often, especially in dealing with their grief in the weeks and months after, or some say happening years after, they don't really want to be out there, right? And that's why, like, I found talking to people 20 years later, they're very happy to talk to me and happy that I'm still talking about their family member and remembering them. But trying to get them to be that way is too much to ask almost. So it's really difficult to say, like, well, let's make this about the victims. Let's make this about the victims' families. Yeah, it's kind of up to them. You know what I mean? But so, it's a great answer. And, answer, but.
Mike, thank you so much for being with us. Thank you so much for having us. We were, when we first launched our show, you were one of the first outlets to have us on to talk about it. And we appreciate you being here as well. And, you tell great stories. And if you want to hear more of Mike's stories and you want to hear more about everything that Mike just said, subscribe to his podcast, subscribe to his show, check out his show. It's called Detective Story with Mike Hammond, and it's fantastic. and it's growing, and hop on board. We'll put links to where you can find that show in the description or in the review wherever you're listening to or watching this. But yeah, Mike, thanks so much.
And I would imagine this will not be the last time we talk, because I've still got more questions. I just am trying to be mindful of our time.
No, I enjoy this. Yeah, my pleasure. I thank you guys. Man. I appreciate it. It was fun to interview you guys about Israel Keys, and that's gotten a lot of traction. I appreciate that, and it's just, you guys are always fun to talk to. So
back at you, man.
Thanks, Mike.
Okay, thank you.